all of it would yell either jump or dive. Yeah, that's why we called it that, right? If the caller said dive, we would somehow have to mid-jump twist our bodies in such a way to attempt to dive. Most of the time in jump or dive, we did neither. And we landed in the water somewhere in between a jump or a dive. And that made it, to be quite honest with you, a good game of jump or dive. I can tell you this. I've gone off a diving board a few times in my life. I count myself to be a pretty good diver if I'm planning on diving. Like if you tell me at the edge end of the diving board that you want me to dive, I can make the proper approach at the end of the diving board. But by the time I bend my knees and you ask me to jump when I am planning on diving, I don't do as well. And that's true in jump or dive, but to be honest, it's also true in life as well. Making decisions in the moment is extremely difficult, and oftentimes we do so imperfectly. And I have found that most of life is lived not at the back of the diving board with everything planned out, but most of life is lived at the edge of the diving board where the situation changes like that. You think about this. You set off into a new work week, a new job, a new marriage, and things never go exactly like you think they're going to. And so when Greg asked me today to speak, and he told me that he was wrapping up a series on habits of the household, which is a book that I absolutely adore. And if you've not read everything by Justin Whitmore Early, you absolutely should. A really great spiritual formation given in a real practical way. When he said he was just finishing that book up, I immediately thought of jump or dive. Because hear me out, I believe that the practices that Justin lays out in the book are totally worth practicing. But you can't do them perfectly. So sometimes when a pastor preaches a sermon, or someone hands you a book and says, this is the way to do it, what you find is when you start to actually live out the things in the pages, doing so is extremely difficult. The good news is, anything worth doing is worth doing imperfectly. And when it comes to following Jesus, it's exactly the same way. The pursuit of awareness of His presence is more important than doing life with Him perfectly. And we see this throughout Scripture, especially in our text for today, which is found in Matthew chapter 14. I'm going to start reading in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to the other side while He dismissed the crowd. After He dismissed them, He went up to the mountainside by Himself to pray. Later that night, He was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was so strong against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw Him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come on the water to you. Come, Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me! Immediately Jesus reached out His hands and caught him. You have little faith, He said. Why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Him, saying, surely, truly, you are the Son of God. That's the word of the Lord. So our passage here this morning begins with a pretty striking word, the word immediately, indicating that this story must come after some other story of importance. And so I've got to flip back in my Bible to the previous page, but if you look back just a little bit early in chapter 14, you see that this account comes right after the feeding of the 5,000. And on the heels of that event, that miraculous event, Jesus instructs his disciples to get into the boat and head to the other side. And so my encouragement for us this morning as we look at this story is to look at Jesus walking on water as a second half of the feeding of the 5,000. If we look at this as one continuous story, two miracles, one story, with the design to show us that Jesus has power over nature. So that said, thinking about these two stories as one, I can't imagine how exhausted the disciples actually were. I mean, think about this. They had spent all day organizing a massive feeding event, coordinating a massive crowd in the heat, and then Jesus tells them, hey, I'm going to go up here. You guys just start rowing that way. Their spirits must have plummeted as they found themselves in the middle of the lake. They had just witnessed something incredible. Like that's a good enough day in and of itself, right? Feeding 5,000 people. Yet here they were in the middle of a storm, paddling for their lives. Isn't it funny? It's striking how quickly feelings fade. The spiritual high and moments of commitments, they matter, but they can evaporate really fast in our lives when we encounter storms. So the disciples, there they were, stuck, getting nowhere, and they must have wondered, did Jesus know it was going to storm? Were there clouds already on the horizon when he told us to paddle off across to the other side? And where is he now? Life storms come on fast, reminding us, with all our intentions in place, just how truly powerless we are. Now, I don't know how you spent the early days of the pandemic. You remember March of 2020, 2 weeks to flatten the curve and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how you spent those first couple of months, but I became really good at loading a dishwasher. In fact, I had it all kind of figured out, and I figured out how I could fit all of our dishes in at one time and truly maximize our loads, if you will. Turn the coffee cups just this way and line the handles up so, and then if you put the plates in here and the bowls in here, and then you take the forks, right, and you put them, at least in our dishwasher, right, you put them points up, right? You don't take a shower on your head, and neither do my forks, right? And so you're laying all this out right and getting it just perfect. And so I carried this skill out of the pandemic and into everyday life now. And a few months ago, my mom was at our house, standing in my kitchen at my sink, loading my dishwasher. And we're doing dishes, and I'm washing, and I'm handing to them. And over the course of several moments, as I'm handing her a bowl, I'm not saying anything, I'm just instinctively doing it. As she puts something in the dishwasher wrong, I am subtly reaching down and correcting it, and turning the coffee mug this way and putting the bowl over here. And this goes on for several moments. Neither of us are saying anything about it when all of a sudden she stops. And she says to me something a mother should never say to her son. She says, "Why are you this way?" Here's why I'm this way. The older I get, the more I recognize that there are so many things in life that I cannot control. And so, therefore, I do everything I can to control everything that I can. I'm talking to somebody about it. I'm working on it, okay? We're gonna figure it out. But to be honest, control is a false need. It's a trait that belongs to God, not us in our human frailty. And when we cling to control, what we're actually doing is we are undermining and distorting the humanity that God calls good in us. We're trying to be something we're not meant to be. And this quest for perfection, for control, a desire to have all of the answers. My friends, it leads us down the same road our ancestors walked in the garden. Take this fruit, and you will be like God. And I think Jesus wants to take that fruit out of our hands and instead replace it with this. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. That's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so we find ourselves in the boat, battling the waves. We must remind ourselves and remember that Jesus is not far off. We are always on his mind. And our story tells us that shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lakes. And in that story and in our lives today, I believe that Jesus always takes the quickest path to us. But the disciples didn't recognize him. They thought it was a ghost, which is, I guess, a good enough thing to think. And perhaps this is because they weren't expecting Jesus to arrive this way, or perhaps it's because they, much like us, assume that rescue is always going to come some way different than it actually does. And above the wind and the waves, Jesus shouts, "Take courage! It is I! Don't be afraid!" And the disciples, they knew this voice. Sheep always know the voice of a shepherd. A better translation of Jesus' response might actually be this: "Take courage, I am." And let the bad grammar catch your attention and remind you of another story that you learned in VBS about a burning bush in a desert. When God appeared to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, and when Moses said, "Okay, who do I tell Pharaoh sent me?" And the bush, God replies, "Tell them that I am sent you." And when Jesus replies this way, it's a very profound and yet direct claim by Jesus. By echoing the burning bush, Jesus is, in fact, claiming to be God. And here he is, once again, on the move to rescue his people. We continue in Matthew 14, verse 28. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus replied. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" So, cue the VBS soundtrack, right? Here we are, we've reached the climactic moment in the story. But what if we've been missing the plot all along? Now, this is undoubtedly a story of faith, and Peter should absolutely be commended for that faith. But it's actually not really a story of faith as much as it is, as N.T. Wright says, a story of half faith, which is what most of us have, right? Faith mixed with a little bit of doubt. And maybe, if we could just divide the room in half, you would fall in the camp of people that can put yourself in Peter's Birkenstocks. Those of us who are bold and brash and brave and willing to throw caution to the wind and step out of the boat. But what about those of us in the room who are more thoughtful and cautious, who prefer spreadsheets to parachutes, who like our silverware and cutlery a certain way in the dishwasher? Is there something in this story for us too? I think it all depends on where we put the spotlight. It is important to notice that Jesus never actually invited Peter to walk on water. Did Jesus care that Peter had this experience? I don't know. But it's not why he walked out there. In fact, if this was Jesus' aim, perhaps he would have kept Peter back with him and sent the other disciples out onto the water and kept Peter on shore with him so he could take a few practice laps, right, before he stepped into the main event. Yet, Peter steps out. But he steps out, remember, the larger context is this. The primary focus of this story is Jesus' mastery of the elements, not of Peter's faith. But yet, we often put ourselves at the center of stories like these, thinking it is a prescription for how we are to act. But what if this is not a story about Peter? What if it's just a story about how powerful Jesus is? What are we supposed to do with that? I think just worship. You see, here's the deal. People in the Bible didn't know they were Bible characters. Right? Miracles didn't happen in their life every day. They were ordinary people, sinful people who made mistakes. But yet, when we read stories like this and we turn biblical narratives into character formation lessons, we actually end up building super disciples out of a collection of stories. And we convince ourselves that we need to have the faith of Abraham, the heart of David, the patience of Mary, and the courage of Peter all at the same time. And we give ourselves this impossible task of living up to these individuals' greatest moments every ordinary day of our life. And no wonder following Jesus feels so impossible and so exhausting. No wonder we feel like it can't be done. No wonder we feel like we can't do it perfectly. But thankfully, things worth doing are worth doing imperfectly. And following Jesus was actually something Peter did pretty imperfectly. The Bible tells us he notices the winds and the waves and immediately took his eyes off Jesus and sank. But right away, Jesus reached out his hand and pulled Peter back up. And perhaps, in verse 31, this might be one of the more important verses for you in this text. Because how you hear Jesus' voice in your head when you read this will tell you everything you need to know about how you feel about your relationship with Jesus. When Jesus asks Peter, "Why did you doubt?" How do you hear Jesus' tone? Is he mad? Is he frustrated? Is he disappointed? When you take your eyes off him and when you begin to sink and when you stumble, how do you hear Jesus' voice when he says, "Why did you doubt me?" I've never doubted my salvation, and I haven't spent too many nights questioning the existence of God. For whatever reason, faith has come easier to me than for some. But for a long time, I doubted that God liked me. I treated my relationship with him as if I had somehow found a cheat code through Jesus and had barely made it in. And so while I was saved, I recognized that God was mostly frustrated with me or annoyed with me. And I would spend eternity with him just kind of against his will. And when I took my eyes off him and I needed him to rescue me, he would do so begrudgingly and frustrated with me. I'm not a dog person. I'm okay with saying it. I don't care where you are on the issue. My mind is made up. I think they're great. I just think they're overrated. We can still be friends. It's fine. But I am not a dog person and finally came to this realization because I had a really bad dog for a number of years. The key word there is had. And I could tell you that this dog was a really bad dog because he did not want to live at my house. I was convinced of this because every time I would let him out to take care of business, he would run away. And so you can imagine how I felt at 10 p.m. in the rain or the snow when I had to go put my shoes on and chase a dog down that I did not want to bring him back to my house against his will. I was annoyed. I was frustrated. But that is not how God leaves the 99 to save the one. That is not how the father runs to his prodigal son. And that is not Jesus in this story. If you feel like you can't follow Jesus until you do so perfectly, you're going to be waiting a long time, because it is something that Jesus never asked or expects you to do. I believe Jesus was delighted to rescue Peter. I believe it was his pleasure. And I believe it is the same for you and for me. And so there they were, not yet back in the boat. The storm still crashing down around them. But as Jesus was holding Peter and pulling him up out of the water, my friends, he was not disappointed. Lightning flashed in his eyes, and I'm convinced of this, that so did love. Look, this story, I don't think, should motivate you to try to live life with more faith. I don't think, like some preachers would, it is my job to stand up here this morning and tell you to get out of the boat. In fact, I think you can follow Jesus extremely well in the boat. Why? Because 92% of the disciples stayed in the boat, and yet they still got to experience Jesus' power over nature, and they still got to respond the appropriate way, and that is through worshiping. They still got to experience everything that Jesus had for them, and they got to stay dry. And for us, wherever you might find yourself following him, whether you're in the boat or out of the boat, on the waves or under the water, we do so imperfectly, knowing that it is Jesus' grace and power and might that sustains anything and everything already. Our job is just to show up and follow him as best we can, as imperfectly as we can, and let him do the rest. If you find yourself here this morning wondering, I'm not really sure what following Jesus looks like in this season, but I think I want to take that first step, or that next step. I know there'll be people standing up in the room here wanting to pray with you. I know there'll be plenty of time to connect in the lobby. My friends, I know this is the type of church that does a really good job at walking with people as they follow Jesus imperfectly. I can tell you this, if it's your first time here, these people don't have it all figured out. They don't have it all together, but we serve a God who does. So I'm going to pray, and then we'll sing a little bit, and then we will be done this morning. Jesus, we thank you for your rescue. We thank you for your rescue in our everyday, ordinary lives, and also in a way we could never fully comprehend or explain. We thank you for rescue from sin and from death that literally changes everything. And so, God, I pray that you would be with us today as we step out in faith imperfectly. I pray that you'd be with this church. May your will be done in Tuttle as it is in heaven. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
Decided